I never imagined my life would change in a single afternoon. I was just a struggling musician, performing at small cafes across New York, barely scraping together enough for rent each month. My guitar case held more hope than cash, and my dreams felt heavier than the instrument on my back. But when I walked into that sleek corporate office on Fifth Avenue, when I saw that little boy sitting in the corner of his father's empire, everything I thought I knew about survival shifted beneath my feet. The receptionist had called my name wrong. "Mr. Hayes? Mr. Gale will see you now." I didn't correct her. I needed this job too badly to care about formalities. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending into another world, one where people wore $1,000 suits and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences that made every word count like currency. Michael Gale's office was exactly what I expected from a CEO who ran half the tech startups in Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, minimalist furniture that probably cost more than my yearly income, and a desk so pristine it looked like it had never seen actual work. But what I didn't expect was the small figure huddled in the corner, a 4-year-old boy with dark curls and eyes that seemed to look through everything without really seeing anything at all. "Mr. Hayes." Michael didn't look up from his tablet. His voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that closed million-dollar deals before lunch. "You're here for the nanny position." I blinked. Nanny? I thought I was interviewing to teach piano lessons to some rich kid. But standing there, watching this man in his expensive suit, his jaw tight with something that looked like exhaustion mixed with desperation, I made a split-second decision. "Yes, sir." Michael finally looked at me. His eyes were striking a shade of green that reminded me of sea glass. Beautiful but worn down by constant tumbling. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt exposed, like he could see every unpaid bill, every failed audition, every night I'd gone to bed wondering if music was worth the poverty. "My son Tate hasn't spoken in 2 years. Michael's voice dropped lower, and for the first time I heard the crack in his armor. "His mother died in an accident. Since then nothing. No words, no sounds. We've tried everything: child psychologists, speech therapists, specialists from Boston, London, even Tokyo. Nobody can reach him." I looked at Tate again. He was building something with blocks, but his movements were mechanical, joyless. It was like watching a ghost go through the motions of being alive. "I don't have experience with trauma therapy," I admitted because lying seemed cruel. "I'm just a musician." Maybe that's exactly what he needs. Michael set down his tablet. Someone who doesn't treat him like a problem to be solved. I approached Tate slowly, careful not to startle him. He didn't acknowledge my presence, just kept stacking blacks in a pattern that seemed random but probably meant something to him. I sat down on the floor a few feet away, far enough to give him space but close enough that he'd know I was there. Without thinking about it, without planning or considering the consequences, I started humming. It was an old lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I was young. Before she got sick, before everything fell apart. The melody was simple, haunting, the kind of song that felt like it had existed forever, passed down through generations of mothers trying to soothe their children into peaceful sleep. Tate's hands stopped moving. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable, but in that moment it felt monumental. His fingers hovered over the blocks, and then slowly he turned his head. Just a fraction, just enough that I could see his profile, the tiny furrow between his eyebrows as if he was trying to remember something important. Behind me I heard Michael's sharp intake of breath. That song. His voice had changed completely, raw and unguarded. "Where did you learn that?" I stopped humming. "My mother used to sing it to me. It's just an old lullaby. I don't even know where it comes from originally." "That's impossible." Michael stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and suddenly he was right there, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. That was my wife's favorite song. She sang it to Tate every single night before bed. I've never heard anyone else sing it ever. It was special to her family, something passed down from her grandmother. My heart started pounding. I looked at Tate, who was staring at me now with those hollow eyes, and I saw something flicker in them. Recognition, maybe, or hope, or just the faintest echo of a memory he'd been trying to forget. "I don't understand," I said honestly. "My mother taught it to me when I was 6. She said her mother taught her. I thought it was just a common lullaby. Michael ran his hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect styling. For the first time since I'd entered his office, he looked human, vulnerable and confused, and desperately trying to make sense of something that defied logic. Can you sing it again? The whole thing. I glanced at Tate. He was watching me with an intensity that felt almost frightening in someone so young. I took a breath and sang, letting the words flow in a language I'd never quite understood, phonetic sounds my mother had taught me to memorize without translation. The melody wound through the air like smoke, soft and persistent, filling the sterile office with something ancient and tender. When I finished, the silence felt sacred. Tate hadn't moved, but tears were streaming down his face. Silent tears that he didn't seem to notice, as if his body was crying even though his mind was somewhere else entirely. You're hired. Michael's voice was thick. I don't care about references or background checks or any of that. Whatever you were making before, I'll triple it. You start tonight. Tonight? I stood up, my knees protesting after sitting on the floor. Don't you want? My son just cried for the first time in 2 years. Michael wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at Tate with an expression that broke my heart, pure, undiluted love mixed with grief so profound it seemed to radiate from him like heat. You did something in 5 minutes that dozens of professionals couldn't do in 24 months. So yes, tonight, I'll have my driver take you to get your things. That's how I ended up in a penthouse apartment, overlooking Manhattan, with a bedroom bigger than my entire previous apartment, wondering what kind of cosmic coincidence had brought me to this broken family. When I finally settled into bed around midnight, exhausted from moving my few possessions and trying to process the surreal turn my life had taken, I heard a soft sound outside my door. I opened it to find Tate standing in the hallway, clutching a stuffed elephant that looked well-loved and slightly torn. He didn't say anything, of course he didn't, but he looked at me with those dark eyes, and I understood. He was checking to make sure I was real, that I hadn't disappeared like some dream he couldn't quite hold on to. I'm here, I whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Tate didn't respond, didn't nod or smile or give any indication he'd heard me. He just stood there for another moment before turning and walking back to his room, leaving me with the strangest feeling that I'd just made a promise I didn't fully understand, but knew I had to keep. The first week in Michael Gale's penthouse felt like living inside someone else's life. Everything was too clean, too organized, too expensive. The refrigerator had a touchscreen. The bathroom mirror displayed the weather. Even the coffee maker required a tutorial. I kept expecting someone to tell me I didn't belong here, that this was all a mistake, that I should go back to my cramped apartment with the leaking ceiling and the neighbors who fought at 3 in the morning. But every morning Tate would appear in the kitchen doorway, silent and watchful, and I'd remember why I'd stayed. He moved through the penthouse like a shadow, present but not quite there, observing everything with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. I established a routine quickly, instinctively. Breakfast at 7:30, always something simple because elaborate meals seemed to overwhelm him. Then activities, puzzles, drawing, building blocks, anything that let him express himself without requiring words. And always I sang the lullaby. Sometimes in the morning while he ate his cereal, watching the milk turn colors from the fruit. Sometimes in the afternoon when the sunlight slanted through the massive windows and painted patterns on the hardwood floors. And every night before bed, sitting on the edge of his mattress while he clutched that worn elephant and stared at the ceiling like he was reading messages written in the shadows. Michael was rarely present during those first days. I'd hear him leave before dawn, his footsteps quiet but purposeful in the hallway. Sometimes I'd glimpse him coming home late, tie loosened, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He'd pause outside Tate's room, listening, and I pretended not to notice the way his shoulders would relax slightly when he heard me singing. On the 5th night, something shifted. I'd just finished the lullaby and was about to stand when Tate reached out and grabbed my hand. His fingers were small and warm, gripping mine with surprising strength. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge what he was doing, but he held on like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. I'm right here, I said quietly, even though he'd given me no indication he understood or cared. You're safe. I stayed like that for 20 minutes, my arm going numb, before his grip finally loosened and he drifted into sleep. When I carefully extracted my hand and stepped into the hallway, Michael was leaning against the wall, still wearing his work clothes, his briefcase abandoned by his feet. "You're good with him." His voice was rough, like he'd been silent for too long. "Better than anyone we've hired before. He just needs patience," I replied, suddenly aware of how close we were in the narrow hallway, how the dim lighting made everything feel more intimate than it should. "And maybe someone who doesn't expect anything from him." Michael studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He was taller than I'd realized, or maybe I just hadn't been this close to him before. There was a quiet power in the way he held himself, even exhausted, even grieving. "Why do you sing like you're mourning someone?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never thought about it consciously, but he was right. There was something elegiac in the way I carried the melody, like I was saying goodbye with every note. "Maybe because I am." "Your mother?" he asked, and I was surprised he'd remembered that detail from our first meeting. "She died when I was 13. Cancer." I'd said those words hundreds of times, but they never got easier. "The lullaby is one of the few things I have left of her." Michael nodded slowly, and I saw understanding pass across his features. We were both haunted by the women we'd lost, both carrying grief we didn't know how to set down. He moved a step past me and his fingers brushed against my wrist, barely a touch. Fleeting and possibly accidental, but it sent electricity racing up my arm. "Good night, Porter." It was the first time he'd used my first name instead of the formal Mr. Hayes. Something about hearing it in his low, careful voice made my chest tighten. I watched him walk down the hallway to his own bedroom, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just crossed some invisible line without meaning to. The next morning, Tate surprised me. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and I was showing him pictures in a nature book, pointing out different birds and making up silly voices for what they might be saying. He didn't react much, just absorbed the information with that serious expression he always wore. But when I got to a page with a blue jay, he reached out and traced the bird's outline with one finger, following the curve of its wings with careful precision. "You like birds?" I asked, not expecting an answer but always talking to him like he might respond someday. Tate looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something other than emptiness in his eyes. Interest, maybe, or curiosity. He turned the pages backward until he found a robin, then tapped it insistently. "Your mama liked robins?" I guessed, working on instinct. He nodded. Actually nodded. It was such a small gesture, barely perceptible, but it was communication, real intentional communication. My throat got tight, and I had to blink back unexpected tears. "We can learn about all different kinds of birds if you want. Would you like that?" Another nod, smaller this time, but definitely there. I spent the rest of the day researching birds, printing out pictures, creating a whole educational unit about avian species that probably rivaled what he'd learned in elementary school. Tate absorbed everything, pointing at images he wanted to know more about, organizing them by color and size with a meticulousness that suggested a brilliant mind just waiting for the right key to unlock it. When Michael came home that evening earlier than usual, I was sitting on the floor surrounded by papers, and Tate was carefully arranging bird pictures in a pattern I didn't quite understand, but seemed meaningful to him. Michael stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "He's been engaging all day," I explained, suddenly worried I'd overstepped somehow. "I hope this is okay." He seemed interested in the nature book, and I thought, "It's more than okay." Michael set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, his eyes never leaving his son. "He hasn't shown interest in anything since." He didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't have to." Tate looked up at his father, and for just a second I saw the ghost of a connection between them, fragile and tentative but there. Michael's jaw worked like he was fighting back emotion, and I realized this might be the first time in 2 years he'd seen his son truly present, truly engaged with the world. "Thank you," Michael said, and the weight of those 2 words carried everything he couldn't express. Gratitude, relief, hope, and something else I couldn't quite name, but felt settling between us like a promise neither of us had made. But both of us understood. 2 weeks into my new life, Tate started drawing. Not the aimless scribbling of a typical 4-year-old, but deliberate, purposeful sketches that revealed a sophistication I hadn't expected. He'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, working with colored pencils I'd bought during a shopping trip, creating images that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Most of his drawings featured birds, dozens of them in various colors and poses. But one afternoon, while I was washing dishes and humming absently, I noticed him working on something different. When he finally set down his pencil and walked away, leaving the sketchbook open, I moved closer to see what he'd created. It was a woman. Even rendered in a child's uncertain lines, I could see she'd been beautiful. Long hair, a gentle smile, arms outstretched like she was reaching for something. Or someone. At the bottom of the page, in letters that were barely legible but clearly intentional, Tate had written 2 words, "Mama singing." My vision blurred. I stood there staring at that drawing, understanding in my bones that this was the first time Tate had acknowledged his mother's absence, the first time he'd tried to externalize the grief that had been locked inside him for 2 years. I wanted to find him, to hold him, to tell him it was okay to miss her, but I knew better than to make this moment bigger than it needed to be. Instead, I carefully photographed the drawing with my phone and sent it to Michael with a simple message. He drew this today. The response came 30 seconds later. I'm coming home. Michael arrived within the hour, which meant he'd left in the middle of whatever important meeting or deal he'd been handling. He'd barely taken off his coat before he was looking at the sketchbook, his hands trembling slightly as he held the pages like they might disintegrate if he wasn't careful enough. Where is he? Michael's voice was strained. In his room, playing with the bird figures we got yesterday. I hesitated, then added, he seemed okay after drawing it. Not upset, just quieter than usual. Michael nodded but didn't move toward Tate's room. Instead, he stood in the kitchen, staring at his son's artwork, and I watched as his carefully constructed composure began to crack. His breathing got heavier, his shoulders started to shake, and then he was crying, silent, wrenching sobs that he tried to muffle with his hand over his mouth. I moved without thinking, placing my hand on his shoulder. It's okay, I said softly. It's a good thing. It means he's processing. He's starting to heal. I thought I'd lost him forever. Michael's words came out broken, barely coherent. After she died, it felt like he died too. Like I lost them both in the same moment, and I've been living in this empty space ever since, pretending to be functional while everything inside me was screaming. I didn't have words adequate for that kind of pain, so I just stayed there, my hand on his shoulder, letting him feel whatever he needed to feel without judgment or expectation. Eventually his breathing steadied, and he straightened up, wiping his face with the back of his hand in a gesture that seemed almost boyish despite his commanding presence. I'm sorry, he said, not meeting my eyes. That was unprofessional. You're allowed to be human, I told him. You're allowed to fall apart sometimes. Michael looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt the weight of that gaze settle somewhere deep in my chest. Why does it feel like you understand? You don't know me. You don't know what I've lost, what I've been carrying. Maybe I understand more than you think, I replied. Loss is loss. Grief is grief. The details change, but the emptiness feels the same. We stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by Tate's bird drawings and the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that cost more than most people's cars, and something shifted between us. Not romantic exactly. Or maybe it was, I couldn't tell anymore, but intimate in a way that made my pulse quicken. Stay, Michael said suddenly. Not just for the job, not just for Tate. He paused, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. I need you here too. These past 2 weeks, having you in this apartment, hearing music again, seeing my son engage with life, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have hope. My mouth went dry. This was dangerous territory. He was my employer. This was a professional arrangement. Getting emotionally involved, letting this become more than it was supposed to be, would complicate everything. But looking at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, feeling the way my heart responded to his presence, I couldn't bring myself to maintain those boundaries. I'm not going anywhere, I promised. Michael reached out and took my hand, deliberately this time, not an accidental brush, but an intentional connection. His fingers laced through mine, warm and solid, and we stood like that for longer than was appropriate or wise, neither of us willing to be the first to let go. The moment was interrupted by Tate appearing in the doorway, his elephant tucked under one arm and a bird figure in his other hand. He looked at us at our joined hands with his usual serious expression, but I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile but close. Michael released my hand quickly, stepping back like we'd been caught doing something wrong. But Tate just walked over to his father and held up the bird figure. A cardinal bright red and detailed. "Is that for me?" Michael asked, his voice thick with emotion. Tate nodded, pressing the figure into his father's palm. It was such a simple gesture, but the meaning was enormous. This was the first time since his mother's death that Tate had voluntarily given his father anything. The first time he'd acknowledged their relationship with action instead of absence. Michael knelt down to Tate's level, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Then Michael pulled his son into a gentle hug, careful not to overwhelm him but unable to resist the contact. Tate didn't pull away, he didn't return the embrace, but he didn't retreat either, and that felt like progress. When Michael finally stood, there were tears on his face again, but this time they seemed different, lighter somehow, less about despair and more about possibility. He looked at me over Tate's head, and the gratitude in his eyes was so profound it made my chest ache. That night, after I'd put Tate to bed and sung the lullaby that had somehow brought us all together, I found Michael waiting for me in the hallway again. It was becoming a pattern, these late-night conversations in the soft light, both of us too wired to sleep, both of us needing to process the emotional intensity of the day. "He's coming back," Michael said quietly. "Slowly, but he's coming back. He never really left," I replied. "He was just waiting for the right person to show him it was safe to return." Michael smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. "And you're that person." "Maybe we both are," I suggested, and the way his eyes softened made me realize this wasn't just about Tate anymore. Whatever was developing between Michael and me, whatever connection was building in these quiet moments, it was becoming its own entity, separate from my job, separate from his grief, something new and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Tate's 5th birthday arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made my hands shake while I helped the event coordinator arrange balloon clusters in the penthouse living room. Michael had insisted on keeping the celebration small, just immediate family and a handful of close friends. But even that felt overwhelming. I'd spent the past 3 weeks becoming so absorbed in our private little world that I'd forgotten other people existed in Michael's life. People who had known his wife. People who would see me as an intruder. The guests started arriving around 2 in the afternoon. Michael's business partner came first, a distinguished man named Richard, who brought an elaborate train set that probably cost more than my first car. Then came neighbors from the building, people with practiced smiles who exchanged pleasantries while their eyes assessed everything with careful precision. I tried to make myself useful, taking coats and directing people toward the refreshments, playing the role of helpful staff member rather than whatever complicated thing I was actually becoming in this household. Michael's sister Bryn arrived fashionably late, sweeping in with an elegance that made me feel instantly inadequate. She was beautiful in that effortless way some people achieve, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably had a designer label I wouldn't recognize. Her eyes found me immediately, and I watched her expression shift through several calculations before settling on polite dismissal. "You must be the new nanny," she said, extending her hand with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard so much about you." "Porter Hayes," I replied, shaking her hand and trying not to read too much into her tone. "It's nice to meet you." She released my hand and moved past me, toward Michael, leaving a trail of expensive perfume that somehow smelled like judgment. I told myself I was being paranoid, that not everyone was analyzing my presence here, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, evaluated, found wanting. Tate sat in the designated birthday throne, a chair decorated with streamers and ribbons, looking overwhelmed by the attention. He clutched his elephant with both hands, his eyes darting around the room like he was tracking potential escape routes. I wanted to go to him, to provide some comfort, but this was his birthday party. He needed to learn how to exist in social situations, even if they made him uncomfortable. When it came time for cake, everyone gathered around singing while Tate stared at the flickering candles with an expression I couldn't quite read. The song felt interminable. All these adults performing enthusiasm for a child who'd spent 2 years locked in silence. When the final note faded, Michael knelt beside Tate's chair. "Make a wish, buddy," he said softly, and I heard the hope in his voice. the desperate desire for this moment to be normal, to be healing. Tate looked at the cake, then at his father, then his gaze moved across the room until it landed on me. Our eyes locked and I saw something pass across his face, determination maybe, or courage. He opened his mouth and I held my breath without meaning to. Sing. The word was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the room it might as well have been shouted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone's glass clinked against a table. Michael's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes wide and instantly wet. Tate had spoken. For the first time in 2 years he'd used his voice, and he'd used it to ask for me. I moved without thinking, crossing the room and kneeling beside his chair so we were at eye level. My throat felt tight, my own eyes burning with tears. I was trying desperately to control. What would you like me to sing? He didn't answer with words, just looked at me with those serious dark eyes, and I understood. There was only one song that mattered. Only one melody that had somehow connected all three of us across grief and loss and impossible coincidence. I sang the lullaby there in front of everyone, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each line. The room had gone completely still, every person frozen in this moment that felt both intimate and uncomfortably public. When I reached the final verse, Tate smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and the tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. Michael was crying openly, not even trying to hide it, and several guests were wiping their eyes. Someone started clapping and then everyone joined in, but I barely heard it. All I could see was Tate, alive and present in a way he hadn't been since I'd met him, and Michael looking at me like I'd just given him back the world. The party continued with a lighter energy after that, people actually relaxing instead of performing normalcy. But I felt increasingly out of place, too aware that I was the hired help who had somehow become the center of attention at someone else's family celebration. I retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of organizing the gift table, needing space to process what had just happened. I was arranging wrapped boxes by size when I heard footsteps behind me. Michael appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it. "Everyone's asking about you," he said. "They want to know how you did it. What kind of training you have." "I don't have any training," I admitted. "I just got lucky." "That's not luck, Porter. That's something else entirely." He moved closer, and I was suddenly aware that we were alone, separated from the party by a single wall. "You gave him his voice back. Do you understand what that means? 2 years of specialists in therapy and medications, and you accomplished more in 3 weeks than any of them managed in 24 months. I just sang a song his mother loved," I said, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. "That's all." No. Michael was right in front of me now, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "It's more than that. You saw him, really saw him, when everyone else was just trying to fix him. You treated him like a person instead of a problem." The intensity in his voice made my heart race. This felt dangerous. Standing here in the kitchen while his family and friends occupied the next room, while his son's birthday party continued without us. But I couldn't make myself step back. Couldn't break the moment even though I knew I should. "Porter." My name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "I know this is complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't say this. But I can't keep pretending." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Every time you're near me, every time you sing, every time you smile at my son, I feel something I thought died with my wife. And it terrifies me." My breath caught. "Michael, we can't." "I know we can't," he interrupted. "You work for me, you're here for Tate. This is inappropriate in every possible way. But I can't stop thinking about you, and I needed you to know that before I lose my nerve." He reached up slowly, giving me time to pull away, and touched my cheek with his fingertips. The gesture was so gentle, so reverent, that it made my chest ache. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. "Tell me this is wrong and I'll never mention it again." But I couldn't say those words, because standing there with his hand on my face, his eyes full of vulnerability and hope and fear, it didn't feel wrong at all. It felt like the most right thing in the world. The morning after Tate's birthday party felt like walking through fog. Everything was slightly distorted, familiar spaces suddenly strange. I'd barely slept, replaying those moments in the kitchen over and over. Michael's confession, his touch, The way my heart had responded before my brain could intervene with all the logical reasons why this was a terrible idea. Michael was avoiding me. I could feel it in the way he left for work before I woke up, in the absence of our usual accidental encounters in the hallway. By mid-morning, I'd convinced myself that he regretted everything, that the vulnerability of the previous night had scared him into retreat. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe we both needed distance to remember our appropriate roles. Tate seemed oblivious to the tension. He was more animated than I'd ever seen him, chattering in short bursts about his birthday presents, actually using words to communicate instead of relying on gestures and expressions. Each sentence felt like a small miracle, proof that something in him had fundamentally shifted. But even while celebrating his progress, I couldn't stop thinking about his father. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Can you bring Tate to the office at 2? I'll drive you both home." The message was frustratingly neutral, giving me no indication of what he was thinking or feeling. I spent the next 2 hours in anxious anticipation, helping Tate choose an outfit and trying not to project my own nervousness onto him. When we arrived at Michael's building, the receptionist smiled warmly and directed us to the executive floor, where Michael was waiting by the elevator. "Hey buddy," he greeted Tate, ruffling his hair with genuine affection. Then his eyes met mine, and I saw everything he wasn't saying: apology, confusion, desire. "Porter, thank you for bringing him." The drive home started in silence. Tate was occupied with a new handheld game, his attention completely absorbed, which left Michael and me alone with our unspoken words. Finally, as we merged onto the highway, he cleared his throat. "We need to talk." His hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. "About last night." "Okay," I managed, my mouth suddenly dry. "I crossed a line," he continued, his voice carefully controlled. "What I said, how I acted, that wasn't fair to you. You're in my employment, and I put you in an uncomfortable cursimus." "You didn't make me uncomfortable," I said quickly, needing him to understand. "Michael, you did." "Then why do I feel like I've ruined everything?" The control in his voice cracked slightly. "I finally have my son back, and I'm jeopardizing that by developing feelings I have no right to feel for the person who made it possible. 'Cause caring about someone is always scary," I replied, "especially when you've already lost so much." He was quiet for a long moment, navigating traffic with unnecessary focus. When he spoke again, his voice was raw. "My wife, Caroline, she died in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light, and she was gone before the ambulance arrived. Tate was in the car too, in the back seat. He was physically fine, but something in him broke that day." I'd known the basic facts, but hearing him say it, feeling the weight of that loss, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm so sorry. I blamed myself," Michael continued. "If I'd driven that day instead of letting her take the car, if I'd insisted on a different route, if I'd somehow prevented it." He broke off and I saw him swallow hard. "For 2 years I've been walking through life like a ghost, going through the motions, running the company, taking care of Tate's physical needs, but not really living, not feeling anything except guilt and grief." He pulled into the parking garage of the penthouse building but didn't immediately turn off the engine. Tate was asleep in the back seat, his game console slipping from his fingers. "But then you came," Michael said, finally looking at me. "And suddenly I'm feeling everything. Joy when I hear Tate laugh. Hope when I see him improving. And something else when I look at you, something I'm not ready to name but can't ignore." I reached across the console and took his hand. "It's okay to feel again. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting her. But what if I hurt you?" His fingers tightened around mine. "What if I'm not ready? What if this is just me confusing gratitude with something else?" "Then we'll figure it out together," I said simply. "Michael, I'm not asking for promises or commitments. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't feel this connection between us." He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, so gently it made my chest hurt. The gesture was tender and devastating and full of unspoken emotion. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," I agreed, trying to lighten the moment. "But you have me anyway." We sat like that for several minutes, hands joined, breathing the same air, until Tate stirred in the back seat and we had to return to our appropriate roles. But something had shifted between us, an acknowledgement that couldn't be taken back. When we entered the penthouse, Michael's sister Bryn was waiting in the living room. I felt my stomach drop. She stood as we entered, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp as they moved between Michael and me. "Bryn," Michael said, surprise evident in his voice. "I didn't know you were coming by." "I have a key," she reminded him coolly. "I thought we could talk about several things." Her gaze landed on me with unmistakable meaning, and I understood immediately that I was one of those things she wanted to discuss. Michael must have sensed it too because he moved slightly closer to me, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "So you're the nanny everyone's talking about," Bryn said, her tone pleasant but with an edge underneath. "The one who's managed to accomplish what dozens of professionals couldn't." "I just spent time with Tate," I replied carefully. "That's all, is it?" She tilted her head, studying me. "Because, from what I'm hearing, you've become quite integral to this household. Almost like you're trying to fill a role that isn't actually vacant." "Bryn." Michael's voice held a warning. "That's enough." But she wasn't finished. "I loved Caroline. She was my best friend before she was your wife, Michael. And watching someone waltz in here and act like they can replace her." "Nobody's trying to replace anyone," Michael interrupted, his jaw tight. "Porter has helped Tate in ways we couldn't have imagined. You should be grateful, not suspicious." "Should I?" Bryn's eyes were hard now. "Or should I be concerned that you're making decisions based on loneliness rather than logic?" "He works for you, Michael. This isn't appropriate and you know it." The accusation hung in the air. I felt my face heat, the truth of her words cutting deep even as I wanted to defend what Michael and I were building. Before I could speak, Michael stepped fully in front of me. "My relationship with Porter, whatever it is or might become, is none of your concern," he said firmly. "I appreciate your worry, but I'm not a child who needs protecting from his own choices." Bryn's expression tightened. "Then I hope you're prepared for the consequences when this all falls apart." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, pausing to look back at me. "For what it's worth, I do believe you care about Tate. I just hope you're not here for the wrong reasons." The door closed behind her with finality, leaving Michael and me standing in the sudden silence. He turned to face me, apology written across his features. "I'm sorry." "She had no right." "She loves you," I interrupted. "She's protecting her family." "I understand that." But understanding didn't make her words hurt less, didn't quiet the doubt now whispering in the back of my mind. What if she was right? What if I was crossing lines I shouldn't, wanting things I had no claim to? Michael reached for me, but I stepped back, needing space to think. Maybe we should cool things off for a while. Let everything settle. The pain in his eyes nearly broke my resolve, but I held firm. Some boundaries once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. And I needed to be certain, absolutely certain, that what we were feeling was real and not just grief and gratitude, wearing the mask of something more. 3 days passed in careful distance. Michael and I maintained polite professionalism, speaking only when necessary about Tate's schedule and needs. The warmth that had been building between us cooled into something brittle and awkward. I told myself it was better this way, safer, but lying awake at night in my expensive bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. Tate noticed the change. He kept looking between his father and me with confused eyes, as if trying to understand why the energy in the penthouse had shifted. His speech had continued improving, short sentences emerging with increasing confidence, but now those sentences often included questions I didn't know how to answer. "Why is Papa sad?" he asked me on the third morning while we ate breakfast. "He's not sad," I lied gently. "He's just busy with work." Tate studied me with those two perceptive eyes. "You're sad too." I didn't have a response for that because he was right. I was sad and confused and second-guessing every choice I'd made since walking into Michael's office that first day. Bryn's words had burrowed under my skin, making me question my own motivations. Was I here because I genuinely cared about this family? Or was I seduced by the comfort and security they represented? On the fourth morning, I made a decision. I started packing my belongings, carefully folding clothes into the same battered suitcase I'd arrived with. It seemed impossible that only a month had passed since then. I felt like a completely different person now, shaped by lullabies and small breakthroughs and a connection I'd never expected to find. I was zipping the suitcase when Michael appeared in my doorway. He'd clearly just come from the shower, His hair still damp, wearing casual clothes I'd never seen him in before. Jeans and a simple sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. "What are you doing?" His voice was carefully neutral, but I heard the panic underneath. "Leaving," I said simply. "You need space to figure out what you really want without me here complicating things." "No." He crossed the room in 3 strides and put his hand on the suitcase, physically preventing me from picking it up. "No, you're not leaving. Michael, your sister was right. This situation, it's not appropriate. I'm your employee. I shouldn't be developing feelings that interfere with my job. Stop." His voice was firm now, commanding. "Stop letting other people's fears dictate your choices." "I'm not." "Yes, you are," he interrupted. "Bryn is scared. She's scared of change, scared of losing another piece of Caroline, scared that I'll get hurt again. But those are her fears, not mine. And they sure as hell shouldn't be yours." I tried to move past him, but he blocked my path, his presence filling the space between me and the door. "Please let me go." "Not until you listen to me." Michael took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. "You're everything, Porter. You brought my son back to life. You made me feel human again after 2 years of just existing. And I don't care what anyone thinks about that. Not Bryn, not society, not the voice in my head that says I should be alone forever as some kind of penance for surviving when Caroline didn't." Tears were streaming down my face now. "But what if this doesn't work? What if we try and fail and it ruins everything for Tate?" "Then we'll fail together," he said fiercely. "But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have been brave enough to reach for something real instead of hiding behind fear and propriety." He cupped my face in both hands, forcing me to meet his eyes. "I choose you, Porter. I choose this, whatever it becomes. And I need you to choose it too." The walls I'd been building crumbled. I surged forward and kissed him, pouring every confused emotion into the contact. He responded immediately, wrapping his arms around me and holding on like I might disappear if he loosened his grip. The kiss was desperate and sweet and felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I whispered, "I choose this too." Michael pulled me into a tight embrace, his face buried in my neck, and I felt his whole body shaking. "Don't leave. Please. Stay with us. Stay with me." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. And this time I meant it completely. A small voice from the doorway made us both freeze. "Porter? Papa?" We turned to see Tate standing there in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes, looking uncertain. Michael and I exchanged a glance, and then Michael held out his arm, inviting Tate to join us. The little boy rushed forward, and suddenly we were all embracing. An unconventional family formed from loss and music and impossible coincidences. "We're a family now," Michael said softly, looking at both of us. "The 3 of us, if that's what you want." Tate nodded against my shoulder, and I felt his small arms tighten around my waist. "Family," he repeated, testing out the word. Something in my chest expanded, warm and overwhelming. This wasn't the life I'd planned, wasn't anything I could have imagined for myself. But standing here, holding these 2 people who'd somehow become essential to my existence, I couldn't imagine wanting anything else. Michael kissed the top of Tate's head, then looked at me with eyes full of tentative hope. "I love you," he said simply, as if the words had been waiting inside him for weeks and could no longer be contained. "I know it's too soon and too complicated, but I need you to know that." My throat was too tight to speak, so I just kissed him again, soft and lingering, trying to communicate everything I felt but couldn't yet articulate. When I finally found my voice, it was barely a whisper. "I love you too, both of you." Tate looked up at us, his expression serious. "Mama would like you," he said to me, and the simple statement felt like a blessing, like permission from someone we'd all been carrying with us. Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling. "Yes, she would have loved you." We stood like that for a long time. 3 people who'd been broken in different ways, finding wholeness in each other. Outside the windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual chaos. Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in this penthouse something impossible and beautiful was being born. This wasn't just a lullaby anymore. It was a new song entirely. One we were writing together, one verse at a time, and as Tate started humming the melody that had brought us all together, Michael and I joined in, our voices blending into something that sounded like healing. like hope, like home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and I knew there would be many, we would face them together. Because some connections transcend logic and propriety, some families are chosen rather than born, and some love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. This was our story now, our song, and we were going to sing it together for as long as the music lasted.